I'm going to talk about private money and alternatives to the kind of monetary systems we have today, both past alternatives, present alternatives, possible future alternatives. So when you boil it down, there are really two fundamental ways to think about money as a social institution. You can think about it as something that was constructed, or the caricature here is invented by a wise king. Right? So there are serious monetary theorists, even today, who think that we wouldn't have money if it hadn't been for the intervention of the state. Their theory is called the state theory of money. And the alternative is the idea that money emerges through an invisible hand process. Invisible hand, of course, was Adam Smith's famous phrase for self-ordering forces. There are orderly social arrangements that come about without anybody planning it, without anyone intending it. Through the interaction of a large number of people, an order emerges, a pattern, a regular pattern of behavior. And in the case of money, the pattern emerges because it's inconvenient to try to barter goods directly for other goods. People discover that some goods are hard to find sellers who are willing to accept, so they start using other goods that are widely accepted as a trading vehicle. Acquire salt and it's easier to buy what you want to go home with than if you come to market with vegetables and you meet trading partners who don't really want vegetables. But everybody wants salt, then salt would be a better medium of exchange. And people take notice of what other traders are using. They converge on a common medium of exchange. Without anybody intending to bring about this social pattern, we get a common money emerging. It's a commodity money. Carl Menger is the first theorist who explained this really in a satisfactory way, and he raised this question: how did social institutions that are useful arise without anybody seeing a need and creating a program to fill the need? It happened because it's in the interest of barterers to use media of exchange that are more conducive to trading, and it's in their interest to pay attention to what other people are willing to trade for, adopt what other people are willing to trade for as what they offer them, and so there's a convergence process spontaneously through the market, and that's a much more satisfactory way to explain the emergence of money, because it doesn't require us to imagine that there was some wise king. So lots of different commodities were used as money historically. Shells in some places, foodstuffs in other places. But we all know that it was gold and silver that rose to the top of the competition among commodity monies. One of the obstacles to using gold and silver historically was when they come out of the ground as gold nuggets or silver nuggets, they're not very uniform. There needs to be a certain level of metal technology to purify gold and silver. Once it's purified, you can make bars out of it, but it's even more convenient if you can stamp the pieces to certify how pure they are and how much they weigh. And that's the function of coinage. And the first coiners, as far as we know, were private merchants who would receive payment in gold and silver and would mark the pieces, and people who trusted their mark would then not have to reweigh the pieces of silver again. And so we got a kind of private certification service in the very early coinage, in ancient coinage. States soon took it over. I'll come to that in a minute. But the picture shows a very late example of private coinage from the gold rush in California in the 1850s. So why have governments decided to monopolize this business? Well, when you ask why government takes over any business, there are two possibilities. One is that somehow they're more efficient at it. They can produce, say, a higher quality product. But the other possibility is that they're in it for the revenue. let's look at the evidence. If you look at the track record of medieval governments, did they maintain the value of their coins? No. Went steadily downhill. That is, coins had less and less silver in them as governments, as princes, as kings debased the coinage. That is, they took the silver out and they put in more cheap metal, tin or copper. And they did that because it was a way to fight wars. It was a source of revenue for them. Right? But it means that we shouldn't expect to find governments improving the quantity of money if their involvement in the monetary system is driven by the need to finance government spending. And that continues to be a concern today. Right? Now, because the princes, the kings, the dukes were debasing the coins in medieval Italy, a new business arose of changing coins from one city to another. So if you left Milan and went to Genoa, people in Genoa didn't know what the coins from Milan were worth. They didn't know how debased they were. They didn't want to, not everybody was an expert in weighing coins and in testing the quality of coins. That's what money changers did. And the pictures show Credito Italiano. It's an Italian money changer. He's weighing coins on his scale, and he's recording in his books the weight of silver in the coins that have been brought to him by one of his customers. So a big part of the business of early bankers was weighing coins and then giving a credit in the books to the customer who had brought the coins in. And from that point on, the customer could pay other merchants, it was merchants who had bank accounts, by transferring ownership of pure silver units. So bank-issued money was more uniform. It didn't have to be tested every time. If you trusted the banker, you knew that when he said, "I'm transferring ownership of 1 ounce of silver to your account," that's what you were getting. So not only was bank-issued money not debased, more portable, it was more uniform than the common coins. So people made transactions by meeting in the bank's office and saying to the banker, "Please transfer money from one account to another." So the money changers became payment service providers. They didn't just store coins for people, they didn't just trade one coin for another. They would keep money on account and arrange to make payments just by book entry. And the very earliest method of arranging for the banker to pay somebody you wanted to pay was you both would meet in the office of the banker, tell him this is what we want to do, and he would make the transaction on his books. And the development of banking techniques, in large part, is just different ways of signaling the banker, telling the banker you want to transfer money to someone else. You can do it by paper check, you can do it by a giro transfer, where the person making the payment signals the bank. That way both parties don't have to meet at the bank at the same time. And of course today we have electronic funds transfer, which is yet another way of signaling the banker. So private enterprises brought about all these improvements in the payment system. Now, one of the practices that developed fairly early in banking was when bankers discovered that people were bringing them money not in order to store it, but in order to access the payment system that the bankers were providing, the claim on the banker, the deposit balance, could now be used to make a payment. So bankers discovered people were not calling for their money every day. They discovered they could put most of the money to work. So here's a bank that owes $200 to its customers, but it only keeps $40 worth of coins in the vault because they've discovered that they've never been asked to pay out more than $40 on a single day. And the thing that makes this work is that the claim on the banker, the deposit balance, which is now transferable, a way of making payments, does everything that the coin used to do. So there's no need to go and get the coin in order to make payments. So the coins are not going to be claimed every day. Right? So this is called fractional reserve banking because the reserve is now only 20% in my example. So the bank is not a warehouse. In fact, by definition, a bank is an institution that takes deposits and makes loans. If it only took in money and never lent it, it wouldn't be a bank, it would be a warehouse. Right? So this is fractional reserve banking. It's pretty obvious what the advantage to the banker is. The banker can now make loans and earn interest on the loans. Or he can buy commercial bills, that is, commercial paper, trade bills. So deposit transfer came first. We have examples of it historically as early as 1200 AD in Italy. A little later come bank-issued slips of paper, which we call banknotes. Here's an example from Scotland. The Union Bank of Scotland promised to pay the bearer on demand £20. So this is another demandable obligation of the bank. At any time the customer wants to, he can come in and get £20, which meant 20 pounds sterling, 20 pounds worth of silver coins. But this slip of paper does everything that the coins does. It goes from hand to hand. And in fact, it doesn't have to go back to the bank to be reconciled the way checks do. Right? Checks are only used once to make a transfer, and then they have to go back through the bank that collected the check has to take it back to the bank that issued the check. They have to settle up. With a banknote, the bank that issued it doesn't know where it is on any particular day. They just know it's out there circulating. So the transfer takes place without knowledge of the bank that issued. And that makes it much more convenient for some purposes. Here are some other pictures because I like to show pictures. I like this one, very pretty. The Nippon Ginkgo Bank. And on this one, the promise is very clear. Promises to pay the bearer on demand 10 yen in gold. Right? So a yen was a gold coin at that point. Here's one I could find that was in Russian. This was issued by a trading company that was operating in Alaska when Alaska was still Russian territory before it was sold to the US government. And there's nothing special about paper. This one is printed on sealskin because that's what they had. Here's a recent banknote from Northern Ireland where there still are private banknotes. There's still 3 places in the world that continue to allow banks to issue their own paper currency. Northern Ireland, where there are 4 banks, Scotland, where there are 3 banks, and Hong Kong, where there are 3 banks. So when is it feasible? Because there is a potential danger here, right? If the bank is obligated to pay $200 on demand, but it only has $40 worth of silver coins in the vault, it's in trouble if more than $40 worth of demands show up on the same day. The economist Ludwig von Mises had a nice illustration or example of this. He said, if you issue tokens for 100 loaves of bread, you had better have 100 loaves of bread, because these tokens are not good for anything else but coming to claim the bread. But you can't eat the token, right? People are going to use it to get the bread. But the great thing about a banknote is it does everything that the coin did. So you don't need to come and get the coin in order for it to be useful for you. Among people who know this bank, who are willing to accept its liabilities, it's as good as gold. Right? So it can circulate, and the bank can count on only a small fraction of all its liabilities coming in on a single day. Now, there is a rare event known as a bank run in which more than that, in which a lot of people try to withdraw their money at the same time. I'll talk about the problem of bank runs a little later, but for now let me just say that they're much rarer than you would think if you read the voluminous literature on bank runs by economic theorists. A worry people sometimes have about a system where banks are allowed to issue their own currency is that you would have floating exchange rates between banks in different cities, or even between banks in the same city. And wouldn't that be a hassle? Wouldn't that be a bother for everyone, inconvenient? It would be inconvenient, and because it would be inconvenient, the banks have an interest in preventing that from happening. If I'm a banker and I want to do more business, then I want to make sure that my banknotes are accepted by other banks around town, and even more widely than that, if I can arrange it, at their full face value. at 100 cents on the dollar, not at a discount. How can I do that? Well, I can make an arrangement with the other bankers. If you accept my notes at face value, I'll accept your notes at face value. And that's what bankers did. So the first two banks that kind of made this arrangement on a regular basis were two banks in Scotland. In the United States, the first sort of organization of a clearing system among banknotes was by a bank called the Suffolk Bank in Boston. And in recent years, we've seen kind of the reinvention of agreements among banks to accept one another's claims through ATM networks. Right? There wasn't any law that compelled banks to accept ATM cards held by customers in other banks. But they did it in order to do more business. A bank that had an agreement with another bank could tell its customers now, or potential customers, put your money in our bank and you can now withdraw it at more locations. The first, in the United States, the first ATM network, automatic teller machine network, was the New York Cash Exchange, or NICE. They were a bunch of smaller banks trying to compete with Citibank. Citibank had 100 ATMs. Each of these small banks had 3 or 4 or 5. By banding together, they now had a network which was as big as Citibank's. And these kinds of gains from agreeing to accept one another's customers, giving each other access to their computers so that the bank could verify that the customer withdrawing cash actually had the funds, was an agreement the banks came to without any compulsion. And the agreements have grown, right? So they started out local, they became regional, nationwide, now they're worldwide, right? Now I don't have to carry traveler's checks when I go traveling around the world. So this is the kind of freely evolved payment system we see when governments don't prohibit it, when they don't hamper the development of banking. We see competitive monetary systems where the basic money is some specie that is coined gold or silver unit, but people don't ordinarily carry around sacks of coins to make payments. They carry around checkbooks, or nowadays debit cards, and they carry around paper currency, banknotes issued by commercial banks in those days. So that's what you see in these kind of banking systems. Sophisticated payment systems, evolving through competition and through innovation. I want to talk a little more about the system in Scotland because that was the sort of greatest example of a freely developed banking system, a free banking system. So there are other examples. Canada in the 19th century had a very free banking system, and it was much more stable than the United States banking system in the 19th century. Sweden in the 19th century had a very stable experience with private note issue. In the New England part of the United States, where the Suffolk Bank that I just mentioned was operating, it was a stable system with notes circulating at par. But there are 50 more examples I could give you if I had all night. So what I want to say about the banking system in Scotland is that it was a system marked by free entry, right? This is kind of unthinkable today. What? Anyone can just open a bank? Yeah, but the banks had, the shareholders in the bank were liable for all the debts of the bank. So depositors didn't have to worry until all the shareholders were bankrupt. They were going to get paid. The shareholders were obliged to pay them. These banks were well capitalized, they were widely branched. In fact, Scotland was the first system to develop a branch banking system that crossed all over the country. So it was a competitive system, but it was a very stable system. And that was a big contrast to what was happening in England. England had a completely different banking law. Scotland's banking law had originated when it was an independent country. And even after Scotland became part of the United Kingdom, they retained their own banking laws. So when Parliament would pass an act dealing with banking, it would be specific to England and Wales, or specific to Scotland, or specific to Ireland. So the banks in Scotland were competing with each other. The difference between the interest rate they paid on deposits and the interest rate they charged on loans was very narrow, maybe 1%, 1.5%. In England, you had a system where the Bank of England had lots of privileges from the government and therefore was safe. The government was going to back it up no matter what. You didn't have to worry if you had your money in the Bank of England. But they paid no interest on checking accounts. They were not competitive. Out in the countryside, you had hundreds of banks that were small and competitive but not very stable, because there was a rule that said they were not allowed to have more than 6 partners. So they were not well capitalized, and that was to protect the Bank of England's monopoly. It's kind of a crazy way to protect it. Eventually they reformed the law and drew a circle around London and said only the Bank of England can operate within this circle. Outside the circle, you're now allowed to have as much capital as you want in your bank, and that was a big improvement, but London was still monopolized by the Bank of England. In Scotland, you had banks that were large in size, but you had 20, 25, depending on which year you look at. So there are economies of scale, but there's no natural monopoly here. It's not more efficient to have one bank serving the entire economy. And I've mentioned the cooperation the banks did through the clearing system. There was one spectacular crash of a bank during this period. It was called the Ayr Bank, appropriately. Ayr is the name of a county in Scotland, so it wasn't a commentary on how the bank was just, made of nothing but air. It quickly grew. It had based on lending money without much care about who they were lending to. The bank went bankrupt. It ruined a lot of people. Adam Smith writes about it in The Wealth of Nations, because it happened just a few years before that. But the system was robust. It didn't pull down any of the other large banks. It just pulled down some small banks that it had borrowed money from. And the system quickly recovered. There's a new book coming out by an author named Tyler Goodspeed, specifically on the Ayr Bank crisis and how the resiliency of the Scottish system after the crisis was remarkable. So a free banking system doesn't mean you'll never get a bad bank, but it means a bad bank won't cause a domino effect where it knocks down other banks and the entire system gets into trouble. Nobody tried to bail out the Ayr Bank, even though it was the largest bank in the country at the time. This is going to be a little technical, but I want to talk about what limits a bank from issuing too much money in a free banking system. Right? Because people sometimes say, wait, you say the bank can issue as much money as it wants. It doesn't have any requirement, any statutory reserve requirement. It doesn't have a ceiling on the amount of notes and deposits it's allowed to put in circulation. That's right. And yet there isn't an orgy of money issue? No, and the reason is fairly simple. The banknotes, as we've seen, have a contract on them, and the contract says, promise to pay the bearer on demand so much silver or gold. Right? So the bank is obliged not to issue more than it's actually in a position to redeem. And of course, it has a practical problem of figuring out how much redemption it's going to face. But a bank that issues more money than people want to hold is going to see all those additional notes come back for redemptions. So if you look at the bank's balance sheet, we could just simply divide it between the reserve assets, that would be gold and silver under a gold or silver standard, and the interest earning assets. And on the liability side, just 2 liabilities, the banknotes and the deposits. And then the difference between the value of the assets and the value of the liabilities is the bank's net worth or equity capital. Right? So if we don't worry about the bank raising more capital, the only way a bank can earn more income is to make more loans. That's L. But to increase L, given this double entry bookkeeping constraint, is they have to either reduce their reserves or they have to keep more notes in circulation or attract more depositors. And the point of the example is it's costly to do any of those things. If they cut their reserves, they run a bigger risk of having insufficient reserves, of defaulting at the clearinghouse. They don't want to do that. If they want to attract more depositors, they have to provide more services, they have to pay more interest, something like that. Those are all costly. If they want to issue more notes, they have to convince more people to become clients of this bank, to hold notes in this bank's notes, or to have deposits in this bank so that when they get currency, they get this bank's notes. When they put currency out of circulation, right, deposit excess currency they've come to hold, it goes through the clearing system and is debited against their bank. So there's a limit to how many liabilities a bank wants to hold just in order to be prudent. So an individual bank then is restrained by the obligation to redeem, and people can either come into the bank and redeem over the counter, but more often they will, if you have more notes than you want to hold, take them to your bank and deposit them. That puts them in the hands of your bank. Your bank goes to the clearinghouse and says to the bank that issued the note, you have to pay us now. And of course the other bank will have some notes to offset the first bank's notes. But the bank that's issuing more notes than anybody is going to have more notes coming back through the clearinghouse. That's going to drain their reserves. And when they see their reserves draining, they know that they have to stop, back up a little bit, let those notes come out of circulation, not try to replace them. So that returns the circulation to its desired level. Okay, so that constrains any one bank from overissuing relative to the banks that are around it. But what if all the banks get together? No reason to think they would, but suppose they all get together and all decide to issue more in unison. What pins the system down? Because now banks are not going to be suffering adverse clearings at the clearinghouse against one another. Every bank, by assumption, is bringing in more notes. So every bank can offset the other bank's extra notes. No bank is going to lose reserves to the other banks. Well, in an international gold or silver standard, this country, call it Scotland, is going to lose gold to the rest of the world. And another Scottish thinker, David Hume, described this process back in the 1750s. A country with excess money is going to see it flowing out until the excess is relieved, and then the outflow stops. So this is part of Hume's critique of the mercantilists who thought that wise policy was to always have a balance of trade surplus so that money is always flowing in and never let money flow out. And we see the remnants of that kind of crazy thinking even in trade policy today, where politicians think it's crazy to allow a balance of trade deficit. You always want to stop that. Yeah, but we're not even on a gold standard, so you don't even have reserves to lose anymore. If you want to protect your currency, don't issue too much of it. Here's a quotation from Mises, who I mentioned earlier. And this is sort of the earliest statement. This is kind of a footnote. Don't worry about it. This book is originally published in 1912, but this is from the 1980 edition. It says, look, a single bank can't put more notes into circulation unless people are willing to hold them, only if there is a demand for them. Now, that's a bank in a competitive system surrounded by competitors. Therefore, the banks can only increase the money they issue and decrease it in accordance with the demands of the public. In doing so, they help stabilize the objective exchange value of money. That is, if people want to hold more money, if the banks did nothing, that would drive the value of the money, the purchasing power, up. That would mean falling prices of goods. By issuing more money, the banks prevent that deflation. If the public wants to hold less money and the banks did nothing, people trying to spend off their excess money would drive prices up. That would be inflation. But if the banks absorb the excess money through the clearing system, that stabilizes the purchasing power of money, keeps the price level from going up. So you have a self-regulating tendency that avoids deflation or inflation caused by changes in the public's demand for money. That's kind of cool. So there was a school of thought in 19th century Britain, I call it the free banking school, which argued that you get a better self-regulation of the monetary system, the more competition you had. And they wanted to introduce competition into London, take away the Bank of England's monopoly. And when I was doing my dissertation research, I remember my excitement when I discovered a memo from the Chancellor of the Exchequer to the head of the Bank of England saying, we've all read Adam Smith, and we're all against monopoly now, so don't expect your monopoly on note issue in the vicinity of London to be renewed next time it comes up. And when I found that, I said, wow, I know at least 4 or 5 banking historians who this is really going to impress. But it didn't happen. The Bank of England lobbied to keep its monopoly privilege, and it became this sort of the world's first important central bank as a result of that. But it had some opponents. But the policy implication of their thinking is you should decentralize money issue and let the different issuers discipline each other. Whereas if you have just one issuer, who's going to guard the guardian? Who's going to discipline the one issuer of money that has a monopoly? So that's the theory of free banking, condensed very small. There are whole books on the topic. Here they are. Several of them are free online from Liberty Fund. Liberty Fund has 2 sites that has books on it. One is OLL, that's the Online Library of Liberty, .libertyfund.org. So George Selgin's Theory of Free Banking, which was a dissertation written under my chairmanship, so I recommend it. Mises' Theory of Money and Credit, and his Human Action has several sections on the theory of free banking. Vera Smith's The Rationale of Central Banking at econlib.org. My own book, Free Banking in Britain, which talks about the Scottish system and the debate over extending a system like that to England, is available from the IEA, which is a think tank in London, as a PDF download. So these are all free online. All right, so we had these free banking models. Why did we get central banks? Well, mostly it was fiscal reasons, as I've already said, and that's clear in the case of the Bank of France, the Bank of Italy, and others. A central bank was created in order to have an institution that would agree to lend the government money cheaply. So Napoleon, who I've learned in the last couple of days of sightseeing, is not very popular in Moscow. Napoleon created the Bank of France and instructed the directors of the bank to paint on the wall of the bank in the director's room, "It is the duty of the Bank of France to lend the government money at 2%. In those days, 2% was ultra low because the government of France had a very bad credit rating. The Bank of England, nobody really intended it to become a central bank, but they gave it these privileges. It was the only bank allowed to issue notes in the vicinity of London, the only bank that was well capitalized in London. It got more and more privileges. It became a central bank. The government kept its money at the Bank of England. Other banks held Bank of England notes as their own reserves. So when the Bank of England expanded, the whole system expanded. In the United States, the Federal Reserve System was created because we had a problem of a weak banking system that was subject to frequent panics. And the weakness in the banking system was due to legal restrictions on the banks. And the clearest evidence for that is the economy of Canada, just north of the border, was very similar, basically wheat-growing economies in the 19th century. Most of the population were wheat farmers. Canada had no trouble in its banking system because they didn't have the same legal restrictions on banks. In the United States, banks were only allowed to have one office in most states. And in some states, they were allowed to have more than one, but they couldn't branch across state lines. So the banks were limited to just lending to the farmers or the cotton growers or whatever the agriculture was in their neighborhood. When the price of that crop went down, all the farmers went broke, the banks went broke. They were not well diversified over different industries. So that was the biggest restriction. It wasn't market forces. So there have been some clever attempts to try to explain central bank as a natural development, there's a book by an economist named Charles Goodhart called Central Banking, a Natural Evolution, ? And it turns out in his story, it's not natural, it's the result of privileges. So let me say something about the track record of central banks. And the one I know best is the Federal Reserve System. I co-authored a paper a couple of years ago with a couple of other economists, Selgin and Lestraps, and we compared the track record of the Federal Reserve System, which has been one of the less inflationary central banks in the world. So it's not the worst case we could look at, and asked, did it perform as well as the gold standard that preceded it? Even though the banking system in the United States was not good during this period, at least we had the gold standard. And so the gold period is tinted yellow here, and the chart is of the price level. And you can see that it's basically flat. In fact, the difference between the starting value of the dollar and the ending value of the dollar in terms of goods and services was like 0.05% change. It was as close to zero as you could get. But after the Federal Reserve is created, we're off to the races. This chart has been squashed down a little to fit it, but you can still see that it's not flat by any stretch of the imagination. Now, it has gotten a little flatter since the late 1980s than it used to be. So inflation rates have come down. That's good. I think part of the reason is there's more competition among currencies due to technologies that make it easier for people to protect themselves. But other central banks even worse than the Federal Reserve System. So inflation's worse. The variability of the price level is worse. This one's a little more subtle, but here's the dramatic evidence. During the classical gold standard, railroads issued 50-year bonds to finance their operations. To get somebody to buy a 50-year bond, they have to trust that the dollar or the franc or the pound they're going to be paid back in 50 years has a predictable value. Nobody can issue 50-year bonds today. All right? Nobody trusts the value of any paper money 50 years out. Nobody knows what it's going to be. The charts here are the rolling standard deviation of the price level. So it bounces around more than it used to. And the second one is a little more sophisticated. If you were trying to predict the price level just by extrapolating, how wrong would you be at a 30-year horizon? Under the gold standard, your errors would be very small because the value of gold had this remarkable self-correcting tendency, right? If the price level is rising, that means the purchasing power of an ounce of gold is falling. That discourages gold mining because now the miners don't get as much goods and services for the gold they produce. So they reduce the amount they mine. That brings the value back up. If prices are falling, if the value of a gold ounce is rising, that encourages mining. That increases the supply. That brings the value back down. So there's a self-correcting tendency in the purchasing power of gold. And so at long horizons, the gold standard had a very good track record of having close to zero inflation. But you can't predict the price level 30 years out, even for the US dollar. The forecast errors are much higher. And that's why people are so reluctant to buy bonds longer than 30 years. Output volatility hasn't really changed. Here's the pre-Fed period, 1869 to 1914. There's a measure of the volatility of output that has basically how big are business cycles. They go up enormously over the Fed's entire period. Our data set ended in 2009. If you just look at the pre-World War II period, it's even worse, right? So that's the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars. But if you just look at the post-war period, right, take out the Great Depression on the grounds that, okay, the Fed didn't know what it was doing, but they were still young, they were learning, that was just practice. The post-war period is basically statistically indistinguishable from the period before the First World War, before the Fed was founded, despite the fact that the economy is much better diversified now. So it should be easier for the Fed. You should see lower variance in the economy, but the Fed hasn't exhibited any improvement. Right? So in exchange for allowing higher inflation, we're not getting less variation in real output. Hasn't reduced unemployment. So why did we leave the gold standard? Why did we go to a system where every government in the world now issues money that's not redeemable for anything? It's an IOU nothing. Dave Barry, I think, provided a much better answer than most economists do. All the governments in the world, having discovered that gold is like rare, hard to come by, expensive, decided it would be more convenient to back their money with something that's easier to come by, namely nothing. And that's basically it. It's much easier to print money if you don't have to worry about redeeming it. And that makes it easier to finance wars or whatever kind of expenditures you have. So what are we going to do about the unreliable money we have now? Well, if we just consider sort of moderate, marginal improvements while still having a central bank, we can try to constrain its behavior a little better. We can try to fix to external currency, like a fixed exchange rate regime, like a currency board, or what Italy and Spain did, and Portugal, in order to have more stable money, they fixed to the Deutsche Mark. And then they put a fig leaf on it and called it the euro, right? Because it was embarrassing just to fix to the Deutsche Mark. So no one country now can print in Europe, in the Eurozone, can print its own currency. Thank goodness, because if Greece could print its own currency, you'd have terrible, terrible inflation in Greece, and you'd still have the debt problem, because nobody would lend Greece money in drachmas. All their debts now are in euros. But there are other kinds of rules that can be fastened on central banks, and there's a lot of discussion among economists. An inflation target, or what I would prefer, a nominal income target, a nominal GDP target. But we don't have to just think within those narrow confines. We can think about what would be better if we could have it. And I think the most important principle here is to allow free choice in currency. So let people use whatever currency they want to use from the existing set of currencies. Use the currency of any government in the world. Use gold or silver. Use cryptocurrencies. There are easier ways to transfer gold now. There have been electronic payment systems linked to gold. An early one was called e-gold. It was shut down by the US government for not having the proper money transmitting licenses. But there's a successor called BitGold, which has just launched. So we'll see how long they survive. They are getting all the required licenses for transmitting money. But the interesting development in the last few years has been the cryptocurrency market. All right, so Bitcoin was just kind of a curiosity for a while. In the last 2 years, the value of the cryptocurrency market has quadrupled. It's worth billions. So there is a possibility of, if we let it, private non-commodity monies, not gold or silver, but cryptocurrencies, which don't promise to pay you anything. Hayek wrote about this topic back in the 70s, and he imagined that private currencies would promise you to stabilize their purchasing power, but they wouldn't give you a contractual guarantee. Well, that didn't happen. What happened instead was the market for cryptocurrencies. You can follow it at coinmarketcap.com. That's where these numbers come from. And on the date I took this, the total market capitalization of Bitcoin was a little over 3.3 billion. But it has competitors. The second biggest is Ripple, which is a private firm. Bitcoin is a kind of a co-op. It was just a fun programming exercise for a bunch of computer wizards, but it's run as a non-profit. Well, it's actually not run at all. There's a Bitcoin Foundation, but the code was just kind of put out there. It's not managed by a firm that's trying to make money out of it. There are now peripheral firms who are trying to make money out of processing payments, but Ripple is trying to launch a private payment system and make money out of it. And to make money out of it, they want to keep the value of the Ripple high and rising because the people who launched it have most of the ripples. And there are a number of others on this list. Anyway, now we have a market we can actually study, and what gives people assurance that Bitcoin won't hyperinflate is the program that determines the number of Bitcoins in circulation. It's on a predetermined path. There's nobody who can turn the crank and create more Bitcoins. The value it's attained puts it among the world's currencies. Here I've measured the monetary bases of the Serbian dinar and the Costa Rican colon. Up there I've got it's the Lithuanian litas and the Guatemalan quetzal. If you look at the size of the liabilities of their central banks, these four kind of bracket the current market value of Bitcoin. Now it's true that Bitcoin's been falling in value slowly over the last few months, but the market for cryptocurrencies hasn't been shrinking. It's basically that Bitcoin has been losing market share to the newer cryptocurrencies that have technical innovations that are improvements over Bitcoin. They're faster, they're more secure, they're more private. So Bitcoin is the first into the market, and that's why it's the largest, but it may not be the last one standing. We don't know. We have to see what the market will support. But that brings us to the possible future, and I will take questions in case I've said anything controversial. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your election. My question is concerning a famous argument of Milton Friedman against private money book by Hayek, which is that nothing in current United States legislation actually prohibit use of any kind of money. It's just people don't want private money. And even now, with all that Bitcoin, we see Bitcoin used in a very special situations, like international transactions, like probably illegal transactions, which are very special, very niche situation. So my question is that, how do you think it is possible to move from current equilibrium with like one currency to a new equilibrium, which probably will be equilibrium according to your argument, with a lot of currencies?
There is a very strong advantage of being the incumbent currency. For the reasons I gave at the beginning, it's convenient for people who want to use money to pay others to hold the money that other people are accepting. And so it tends to perpetuate itself. It doesn't, put it another way, there isn't much advantage to being the first person in your town to accept Swiss francs if nobody else wants to accept them from you. It's going to be very hard for you to use that as a medium of exchange. The practical value of making sure this remains an option for people is to constrain the central bank and to have this system on standby for the day when the dollar becomes unstable. So in a way, my message is more relevant to countries with higher inflation than it is to the United States. And in my own backyard in Latin America, it's very important to have the freedom to use US dollars. That's the most popular alternative currency because there's a lot of trade with the US. And some governments in that region have tried to suppress the use of dollars. So that's very harmful for their citizens. But you're right, as long as inflation remains very low, there's going to be not much demand for alternative currencies. But that's a good thing.